Before I was a YouTuber, I injected other people with drugs, but now I inject myself. Conquest of Elysium 5 is a turn-based strategy game developed by two Swedish men who are staking their entire reputation on the belief that peak web design occurred somewhere around 1994. In this game, you will choose one of various highly detailed factions and autistically read every page of the wiki until you stop losing to the Baron on turn 3. But no matter where you look on the wiki, you will not find anything about beating the game using an army of slaves, because it's a terrible idea. The humble slave sports a whelming attack of 1 to 4 damage, a mere 4 hit points, and such exciting abilities as level 1 spear, which makes it an interesting choice against enemy factions equipped with armies of animated weapons, legions of the undead, and even God himself. Fortunately, I have a foolproof strategy to help us overcome these challenges. But before we go any further, I have to tell you something. 6 years ago, I was committed to a maximum security mental hospital. Every single day, they would administer to me 37 Flintstones vitamins, 1 gang beating, and a 40-minute session of CBT. They call this modern therapy. However, there's only one thing that silences the maelstrom of unspeakable thoughts rampaging through my broken mind, and that is Rise of Kingdoms, a free-to-play real-time strategy game. In this revolutionary gaming experience, you play as one of several historical leaders and expand your empire through military action and clever economic strategy. However, this is more than a game to me. This is my life. Just yesterday, I asked Attila the Hun what I should do about my noisy neighbors, and I followed his advice religiously. I recently started playing the game again, and you should too, because they've added a new civilization, the Mayans. This faction gets a massive gold buff, which will help it compete with its enemies such as the Romans and the Chinese. But that's not all. Returning players will get new commanders King Arthur, Lady Six, and 6 tavern heroes completely for free. If you've ever wanted to rewrite history where King Arthur starts the First World War and the Mayans turn France into a penal colony, now is your best chance. Use my link in the description to try Rise of Kingdoms today. Alright, let's start setting things up. We choose the Priest King faction because it offers the most robust slave economy in the game. Then we set the map to large, add 9 random opponents, pray to God one of them isn't a necromancer, and begin the match. Our empire is born in the arid savanna to the east of a giant stone golem and south of a pack of man-eating wolves. This is considered relatively safe by Conquest of Elysium standards. Now let's set some ground rules. This faction has access to a wide variety of recruitable units to build a diverse and well-balanced army. We are going to ignore all of that. Instead, we will only use slaves and units which interact with slaves, such as the Tribal King for hunting them down, and the High Shamans, which are capable of sacrificing them in exchange for powerful rewards. For example, we can sacrifice 25 slaves to summon a magical turkey. I am considering this acceptable. Now let's talk about the strategy. This is Kukstal, the Tribal King. If we take him to a populated city, we can use his ability Hunt for Slaves, which generates between 1 and 20 slaves each turn. Not only is this completely free, but the supply of available slaves appears to be infinite, meaning we can buy hundreds of Tribal Kings, set them up AFK farming in our base, and then build armies with thousands of slaves each turn. Forget apartment rentals. This is the ultimate passive income. But right now it's just Kukstal, so we need to capture additional towns and villages to be able to afford more tribal kings. So I gathered up some slaves and set out to expand our empire, but for some reason the very universe itself seems to resist the development of our slave utopia, because the first few times I tried to expand, I was promptly beaten to death by a gang of monkeys and trampled by an elephant. However, on the third attempt we finally had some luck. Overrunning the militia of this market village allowed us to set up an additional slave recruitment center. At this point, you may be wondering, is this really the entire plan? Just human wave tactics with kidnapped peasants? The answer is yes, mostly. Our Priest King also plays an important role because of his blessing abilities. In the middle of combat, he likes to throw bottles of holy water at his slaves and imbue them with powerful blessings. So instead of useless meat shield, they turn into useless meat shield plus 1 health. However, the fun thing is that we can sacrifice slaves to permanently upgrade our blessings. So best case scenario, we wipe out 90% of our own population to turn the remaining 10% into super soldiers. But we're getting ahead of ourselves because someone's already invading our territory. After some investigating, we come across the Baron and his castle. This faction gets disgusting once their economy hits mid-game. Meanwhile, our economy peaked somewhere around 2 turns ago, so we need to eliminate the Baron as quickly as possible, which means it's time for a slave sacrifice. Gentlemen, look at the man on your left and the man on your right. You will all die. Now, stand still. I used my Priest King to sacrifice 50 slaves in exchange for a couple of jaguars and a floating cat. Not exactly the divine blessing I was hoping for, but either way, we waited until the Baron left his castle and we sieged it on the next turn. No matter how desperately my slaves clawed at the gates, they couldn't break through. However, we won anyway because the Baron's archers got so tired from massacring our slaves that they actually died of exhaustion. This is a high-level slave strategy and definitely not something I did by accident. Since it's still early game, this was the Baron's only castle, and by capturing it, we eliminated his entire faction. 1 down, 8 more to go. And it looks like we found our next enemy. To the west, I spot something truly horrific. Another Priest King. This Pretender King is not only stealing my identity, he's also stealing my slaves. I know I said earlier that the slave supply was infinite, but that's still not enough to convince me to share with this hack piece of garbage. So I head back to the capital to replenish our ranks. Now with 80 slaves, we push toward the False Prophet. His first castle is defended by exactly 2 people. We attack it, and I stare at my screen in bewilderment as we lose 65 men in the process. Fortunately, we've got 5 tribal kings doing 24/7 slave hunting, so they're quickly replaced. Pushing deeper into enemy territory, I come across his Bastion of Darkness. After last siege, it became abundantly clear that if we attack this, we will die. So I sacrifice 125 slaves to the God of War. In exchange, he blesses us with a giant parrot. It may look like our god is just scrounging up these blessings from between his couch cushions, but the parrot is actually perfect. It has a siege ability which allows it to drop boulders on enemy defenders. So we took our army and attacked the enemy capital city. The boulders weakened the gates enough for us to break through, at which point I realized the parrot also knows level 2 fire magic, and he spent the entire fight immolating the terrified defenders. Very nice. So we captured the Priest King's base, and I enslaved everyone. Men, women, children, cats, dogs, here's some shackles, a spear, and a 37-second life expectancy. Have fun. Naturally, the enemy Priest King, s.lth.top, didn't take too kindly to this, and he brought back his main army to kill us. This was a big issue, until he decided to attack a Hydra, which ate half of his units. Then we jumped the other half and stabbed them to death with 400 slave spearmen. The loss of his main army and capital city spelled disaster for the imposter king, and 3 turns later his faction was extinct, thus giving us control of the entire bottom left corner of the map. To celebrate this monumental achievement, I decided to sacrifice 100 slaves to summon a Balaam. This is a jaguar the size of an elephant. You can tell it's a jaguar because it has the exact same icon. The art budget is truly in dire straits. On to the next target, the Druid. You see this forest? You see how it's kind of extra green? That's how you know you've got a Druid infestation. These little weirdos will invade your ecosystem and start talking to all of the animals, and even some of the bugs too. They'll radicalize them against you with their extremist ideas, and before you know it, you're being eaten alive by an army of rabbits. In fact, there's one of his sick little armies right now. We have to put an end to this before he forges alliances with the elephants. Heading south, we immediately come across the main Druid stack, a centaur army fielding several boars, grizzly bears, and a few moose. As the battle started, his sick Druid plans became clear. He's using mass sleep spells to roofie half of my army, and then he's deploying his moose as armor-piercing missiles and driving them straight through my front line to try to reach my casters. However, I've got like half a kilometer of front line, so the moose burnt up on entry. After that, we just worked our way through the petting zoo that was his army, lit his commander on fire, and pulled his neck apart with jaguars. Now that's how you deal with a Druid infestation. While we were stomping on the Druid's head, I couldn't help but notice a bunch of purple armies running around our territory. These belong to Tedbolt the Demonologist, and he's teleporting them here using this magical gateway. His armies are full of ghouls, devils, lesser demons, and Tedbolt himself. Now the satanic arts are one thing, but I do not take kindly to the elderly. Ted's gotta go. To accomplish this, I recruit a new priest and pray to the god of death. I was hoping the death god might just kill Ted in a motorcycle accident, but instead he provided us the tools to do it ourselves. By throwing hundreds of slaves in a volcano, we were awarded Bolan Tiku. He's a powerful spellcaster with death magic. So I took him, 1,200 slaves, and this weird fish guy and attacked Ted in a tribal village. Now, I was prepared for the Demonologist to know a few spells. However, I was not prepared for his dogs to be able to breathe fire. In a matter of minutes, the dogs alone had incinerated hundreds of slaves while suffering no casualties. I thought this wouldn't be a problem, because way in the back line, my fishman was spending the entire time summoning animated puddles of water. However, I failed to account for the fact that the Demonologist was not only killing my slaves, but he was also reanimating them into soulless corpses to attack me with. If this fight was a chess match, now would be the time we slam our head on the board as hard as humanly possible. But what about Bolan Tiku, I hear you say? Oh, don't worry, they lit him on fire and beat him to death. So, long story short, we lost 1,200 slaves in a single afternoon. Meanwhile, Ted went from 62 troops to 29. That's a 36-to-1 casualty ratio. As if that wasn't bad enough, I took my Priest King and wandered into the forest to clear my mind. But instead of peaceful reflection, I found a Druid waiting for me with a gang of radicalized caribou and venomous snakes. They wasted no time killing everyone I had, including the Priest King. This was an all-time low for the Slave Empire. As I look around the map, I see several other factions thriving. The Demonologist is taking all my territory, the Druids are forming interspecies marriages at an alarming rate, and the Pale Ones have a sizable army full of disgusting cave creatures. Why can't we succeed like this? Is it because I keep hurling my subjects to their death? Maybe it's the 99% illiteracy rate. No, it's because we're not trying hard enough. We need to sacrifice everybody. This has to be done. I recruit a Priest of Blood, then I use hundreds of slave sacrifices to ascend him to a High Priest. From here, we offer 500 slaves to cast the spell Summon God, and from that, our Priest King is transformed into the God of Blood. This is an extremely powerful unit. Yes, I am aware of the irony of doing a slave-only run and then summoning God, but just think of him like the Gestalt slave, a combination of thousands of slaves distilled into a single entity. He comes with a wide variety of abilities, such as the ability to summon an army of jaguars, breathe poisonous gas, and most notoriously, he can cause blood to rain from the sky. The primary use of blood rain is to terrify your enemies. The secondary use is nuking your bitrate and making your recording look like shit. You really thought this game couldn't get any less legible, but I will always find a way to disappoint you. Anyway, between God and 5,000 slaves, I think we're ready to make a comeback. Tedbolt is still busy ripping apart my dozens of slave armies, which means he wasn't able to stop us from entering this gateway, taking it back to his territory, and attacking his capital city with the God of Blood. The siege was flawless. The Rain of Blood ability hits the entire map and has a 50% chance to cause each enemy to flee. After 4 casts, all of the defenders were running off the map, except for the archers, which were trapped inside this guard tower. But not to worry, they were subsequently devoured by snakes. After this, it was open season on Ted's kingdom. His primary armies were still tied down killing slaves in the desert while we slowly demolished his economy. By the time Ted did get back up to fight us, it was a bit too late, and he died a noble death of being covered in blood and having poison spit into his eyes. Just terrific. That leaves the Pale Ones and the second Druid faction. Speaking of which, the Pale One has been going around the map starting forest fires, which is narratively inconsequential, but I do enjoy knowing that somewhere in the world the Druid is crying. I decide to seize this opportunity by tracking him down and attacking him. If you're expecting his faction to have developed some new technology since the last time we met, you fundamentally misunderstand the limitations of the subhuman Druid mind. Druids cannot comprehend anything above shitting in the woods and having sex with trees, which is why over the past 60 turns, our armies have evolved from slaves to God, and their army is still just a handful of wild animals. It may then be unsurprising when I tell you that we absolutely slaughtered them in this combat. His centaurs went into a frenzy mode, which made them invulnerable to fear, but just about everything else was packing it up after the battlefield flooded with blood. Additionally, the Blood God is giving my slaves regeneration, so we're getting pretty crazy frontline value out of a bunch of random bums I found at the bus stop. After that victory, it was just a matter of tracking down the Druid's final commanders, and before long, his faction was eliminated. This leaves us with just the Pale Ones, a race of subterranean mutants. Now, in preparation for fighting the Pale Ones, I thought it might be a good idea to capture the Capitolium from this neutral faction of barbarians. What I forgot was that the barbarians specialize in dark gypsy magic. This isn't the kind of stuff that kills you, it's the kind of stuff that makes you wish you were dead. So we won the battle, but in the process, the Blood God had been permanently cursed about 7 times. He has 2 missing eyes, a chest wound, a debilitating wound, a never-healing wound, low-grade PTSD, temporary insanity, and erectile dysfunction. The functional consequence of this is that God is now completely blind, pisses himself when fireworks go off, and sometimes he'll just go comatose and refuse to move for months at a time. Needless Needless to say, I think it's time to worship a new deity. For this purpose, I chose to ingratiate myself with the god of war, and also the god of the night. By this point, we had 50 tribal kings, and we were recruiting 1,000 slaves every few turns, so finding the sacrifices to summon them wasn't difficult. Obviously, both gods are immensely dangerous, but what's really exciting about them are these spells. Army of Darkness gives all of my slaves the ethereal trait, which makes them avoid 75% of physical attacks, while Army of the Sun gives them the awe status. Basically, my slaves become so magnificent that every attack against them has to pass a morale check, which is basically impossible when blood is raining from the sky and terrifying everyone. Essentially, the combination of these spells make our slaves demigods in their own right, which is great because the Pale Ones have been ramping up their war of aggression, and they've even formed a navy. I'll be honest, I have a hard time believing that the Pale Ones know what a boat is, let alone how to sail one, but either way, we should probably kill them to be safe. As I was gearing up for this war, I received a notification telling me that Boneheart the Ghost Mage had started to construct a monument to Hades, which will draw all of the monsters from hell into this mortal plane. The game highly recommends stopping him, but I scanned around the map for 30 seconds and I didn't see anything, so I kind of forgot about it. Sure, it is a little weird that we've been getting attacked by ghosts these past few turns, but much like climate change, this is going to be a problem for future generations. Now, onto the Pale Ones. They have about 40% of the map under their control. However, we're making 10,000 slaves every 5 turns. In fact, we have so many that the game is struggling to even process the battles. So I just fanned everyone out and started picking off settlement after settlement until I found their main army. It had the usual trappings of Pale One filth, cave cows, lots of fire, and some giant earth elementals. But they also branched out into necromantic rituals by mummifying their dead and reanimating them into cavern wights. Cool trick and all, but we have the literal army of God. Admittedly, the earth elementals lasted longer than I thought, and they were even tunneling all over the battlefield, crushing dozens of slaves at a time. But it just wasn't enough, and by the end, their army was in shambles. Now it's time to track down their subterranean hideout and finish this for good. I was prepared for this search to take months, but it turns out their cave is just like 60 feet to the east of our border, so we let ourselves in and attacked their capital. The battle began with their catapults firing indiscriminately into my army. However, there aren't enough rocks in the world to kill this many slaves, and even if there were, the rocks would have probably been more valuable anyway.
Me or this white rock right here? Be honest, don't lie to me.
The rock, it serves a purpose.
The primary challenge with this siege was the very narrow 2-tile bottleneck around the gate. This meant we could only stab it with 2 slaves at a time. Additionally, the collective mass of thousands of rabid slaves pushing forward was actually forcing hundreds of my units into the enemy moat, at which point they would drown. It wasn't until one of my gods tunneled through a rock wall and created a new entry point that we flooded into the hideout and captured his capital. That's all she wrote for the Pale Ones. Normally, this is where you'd get a victory screen. However, there's still one minor problem. That Ghost Mage from 20 turns ago? Yeah, he actually finished building the monument to Hades, and now the map is swarming with 500 stacks of ghosts. Also, I want to get ahead of the allegations here. The sudden appearance of thousands of ghosts has absolutely nothing to do with me sacrificing thousands of slaves. This implication is communist propaganda, and I'll have none of it. Anyway, the map is flooded with violent spirits. The funny thing is that our slaves are still winning, but the amount of ghosts appears to be doubling every few turns. So we need to find and destroy the source of this dark magic. The only section of the map we haven't explored yet is the northeast, so I sent a few armies in that direction. Before long, I came across Typhon the Wraith and 540 dispossessed spirits. I think we're on the right track. I rushed Typhon with about 500 slaves, but Wraiths are very good at 2 things, AoE and lifesteal, which are the exact 2 things you need to kill 300 slaves by yourself. Eventually, we broke his morale and he died from a panic attack. Pressing further north, we worked our way through a few more ghost armies before finally finding it, Boneheart the Ghost Mage and the Monument of Hades. We attacked the fortress containing the monument, and there was no problem killing 90% of the defenders, but the Ghost Mage himself was terror routing most of my army and killing the rest of them. However, you know who he didn't kill? God. Teodal, the god of night, cast Lunar Brilliance and smokes Boneheart in the face for 5 damage, killing him on the spot. After the battle ended, we were awarded our victory screen and a lovely faction score graph, at which point I realized, holy shit, it was never even close. Well, that's going to be it for this video. We set out to prove that the humble slave isn't so helpless after all. In fact, in great enough numbers and with enough ritual sacrifice, it can become one of the strongest units in the game. Thank you to this month's patrons, and finally, thank you for watching.